On behalf of all assembled here today, I should now like to invite our newest alumni, Dr. Hebert, to address Convocation.
Well, it's always a bit embarrassing for someone whose role model was the cartoon character Tintin to start giving life advice to graduates who have just spent 3 or 4 or more years studying hard. People always ask of the many of us in my business why we have a cartoon character as a role model. And for those of you who aspire to be journalists, I will tell you why he is such an ideal. He got to travel the world, and as far as I can tell, he never had to file a story. And that would be the ideal assignment for any journalist. I have some few memories of being here, although I suspect that the people who are the esteemed professors here would not remember me. I was a student briefly as a journalist in a short course in law and journalism that was offered by this university in 1984. And if only to give you a sample of my academic versus journalism career, I skipped out of the 2-week course for 4 days to go spy on the Liberal convention that replaced Pierre Trudeau with John Turner. And of course didn't tell my bosses who had paid for me to be here. But it was always journalism that kind of drove me to academia and not the reverse. And so I spent my years at Glendon College trying to write essays so that I would be practicing for journalism. And the best essay I ever got back from a professor, I got a B+, but it was the comment that I really liked. It said, "Too journalistic." And I thought, I am putting this education to good use. So about those life lessons, I don't have very many. One of those is to do what you love, but also to love what you do. And they are not the same thing. You can find love for what you will end up doing, even if, as you sit here, you do not think that it is what your love is going to be. And also, don't make plans. It will save you from having to trash it. I chose to go to Glendon College in large part so that I would not have to do any written work in English. And I managed to spend 3 years there, and I got out with decent marks, but I did not write a word in English. I didn't think that I could, and I didn't think that I wanted to write in English. I also saw myself as an editor. I had this retiring personality, very shy, and I figured I'm going to go into journalism, but I'm going to be a newsroom person. I'm going to be behind the scenes. I'll never go in front of a microphone or a camera. I pursued that course for about 3 years until I applied for an editing job higher up in the food chain and was refused. And what usually happens after events like that is that they want to get you out of the way. So I was shipped to Queen's Park because my bosses didn't want to have me around in the newsroom anymore. And you would be surprised at how many of us actually cover the political beat because one day a supervisor wanted to get rid of us. Of course, I never came back. And on those very flimsy foundations, based on this great career plan that wasn't working out really well, I started what turned out to be a rather extraordinary journalistic voyage from one end of Canada to the other, but also that got me to straddle the language divide. And along the way, I discovered that Canada certainly does not have a long history in the sense of centuries and centuries of tradition. I was in London, the other one, last week. And, you know, as you look at the foundations of what our political systems came from, the justice system, you realize that we are a very young country. But Canada does have something else that other countries who have this large history do not or have not preserved in the same fashion, and it has a history of stories. And the best of those stories I found are not to be found in Parliament, especially not these days, or in leadership convention halls, although sometimes they are, but not when it is a coronation. That's a bit like watching a royal visit. The latest liberal one would be a case in point. But because what I did for a living all my life was to tell a story, I'm going to tell you a story, which was for me one of the better stories that came my way in journalism. And if you can draw from it that journalism is made of chance episodes rather than some theory that you apply to events, that is probably as good as it's going to get. I was the bureau chief for La Presse then, and the Chrétien government had just been elected. It had been in office for about a year. And the controversy of the day revolved around the military college in Saint-Jean, Quebec, which was being shut down by the government, and which was one of those places, it was argued, where if you were going to have officers who could perform in both official languages, it was one place where they could get immersion in French as they did their officers' training. So the closing of that was quite controversial, and it was being replaced, the college and the courses, by the Kingston Military School, which is slightly less francophone, although the MPs from Ontario were arguing at the time that Ontario was bilingual enough to take over those responsibilities. And as we were in the middle of all this, I got a phone call from someone who said, I have a story you might find interesting. A person who was calling lived downtown Toronto and had gotten a fundraising phone call from the Metro Toronto Zoo the night before. And the person was explaining why the zoo needed support. And at some point, that fundraiser said, you in particular, you have a francophone name, you should want to give us money, especially this year. And so the person, my friend, asked, well, why me as a francophone? And the zoo person said, well, because we had to spend extra money because we got a hippopotamus from Quebec and it didn't understand English. And so we had to hire a French language trainer to help it get adjusted. So I thought, this sounds like, you know, a bit of the rip-off of the century, but still, it was lunchtime and I was bored and I had a phone next to me, so I figured, why not? It's not what usually parliamentary people do to actually call outside the bubble of Parliament Hill, but so I called the only zoo I really knew in Quebec, which is the Granby Zoo, because when I was a child living up in Ottawa and Toronto, it was the name that always came up, so I dial and I asked to speak to the person who talks to people like me, and I put it to her. I say, I was talking to someone about the Metro Toronto Zoo, and apparently you sent them a hippopotamus that does not speak English and understand English. And the person cut me off. She says, no. She says, all our animals are bilingual. And I thought, there must be something I've missed here, because, you know, she should have laughed and said, and she says, in this area of the Eastern Townships, it's a very mixed French-English area, and our animals are fully exposed to both official languages. So this animal did not come from here. Why don't you try, she said, the zoo in Saint-Félicien up in the Saguenay? It probably comes from there. So feeling slightly less stupid, but a bit like I'd landed on a different planet, I called the zoo in Saint-Félicien and I put the same question to the person in Saint-Félicien. And the person there, a man in this case, said, yes, true. We did send a hippopotamus that could not understand English to the Metro Toronto Zoo, and the animal did have problems getting adjusted to the environment. They did have to take steps to reassure it by hiring a feeder that could speak French to it while it got adjusted to the environment. Of course, when I wrote that column, and I had a lot of fun writing it because it writes itself, the conclusion to it was that there are MPs and the government that argue that Ontario was bilingual enough to train army officers that are bilingual, but it is not bilingual enough for a hippopotamus from the Saguenay. Two things, if you get in my business, never lose your sense of humor, but also never lose your curiosity. It will serve you better than your mind, as great as it may be. I want to thank you for having made me feel at home in London, and I suspect that if a hippopotamus came your way, it would probably find a way to be happy here after a few weeks of adjustments. Thank you.